If you had to put a compass point at the centre of the British Isles and sweep the circle round it, this would be the community the nearest to the centre of the British Isles, here on the Isle of Man. Scotland's about 35 miles to the north, Ireland about 40 miles across there to the west, Wales about 60 miles down to the south there, and to the east, again about 40 miles away, England. The Isle of Man is not only a mysterious place, as we can see from its origins, it's also a unique place. It has the tailless cats, the six-horned sheep, but its own parliament, the Tynwald, its own currency, its own traditions. It's a tax haven, which many people know about. It has laws which have long passed away in England, which many people object to. Although it acknowledges the Queen, she's known here as the Lord of Man, because the Isle of Man is an independent member of the Commonwealth, with its own very deeply set traditions. To most people, it's a place where a lot of them have come from holidays, busy, noisy holidays in Douglas, sightseeing holidays all round this island, which somehow is in a sort of time warp, it seems to me, still rather attractively in the 50s, or to nostalgic and sweet places like Port Erin just behind me. There's a rich variety of landscapes ranging from the sea-washed stacks of the chasms in the south to the remote and lonely shingle plains of the Airs in the north. Men too have left their signature indelibly stamped on this landscape in the form of hill forts, Viking longhouses, medieval monasteries, castles and prehistoric monuments. These stones at Mull Hill in the south of the island once formed part of a collective prehistoric burial. Of course, other stone-built tombs exist elsewhere in the British Isles, but none like this one. This is entirely Manx. It's unique, part of the personality of the Isle of Man. The TT races originally began by the RSC in 1904 as a reliability trial for cars. By 1907, it had become a race for motorcycles. In the first race, 25 competitors started, but only 10 finished.
I mean, one always looks back and says, it isn't what it was in my day. I think the 50s were very interesting because there were so many different manufacturers involved. I mean, even in the Grand Prix on the continent, it was quite normal to have 16 actual works machines and works riders on the starting grid. This now is probably down to 4 or 5. So in that respect, I suppose the 50s were remarkable years. But on the other hand, the racing over here is still very, very interesting and very exciting, as proved by the fact that we have so many people coming over each year. 10,000 motorcycles, for instance, came this year. Most races these days are on man-made tracks. It's got every conceivable type of corner, from corners which can be taken sort of in excess of 150 miles an hour, down to Governor's Bridge, where they're probably down to about 10 or 12 miles an hour. So really, it's absolutely unique, in particular since the Nürburgring in Germany disappeared from the scene, which was a very famous road circuit also. The TT is now completely out on its own. Well, the machines, of course, have been developed to an absolutely remarkable extent, in particular tyre development, as it has done in Grand Prix racing for cars. They get what they call these slick tyres, which give an incredible amount of grip. Suspensions have obviously improved an awful lot, and the other very big factor over here is, of course, disc brakes. So the machines have altered a lot, but also riding styles have altered. Most people will have seen on television the way riders, what I call clamber around the machine these days. They sit virtually to one side and lean in, which in theory reduces the angle in which the machine has to be leaned over on a given corner. But again, that's open to debate. I think it's a rather untidy way of going on. And generally speaking, you find even the top flight riders, when they come over here, confronted with a different type of circuit, they ride more in the old-fashioned way, shall we say.
If the TT is typically Manx, so too is the tailless Manx cat and the multi-horned Lockton sheep, a strong reminder of the insularity of the country. There are few places other than the Isle of Man where it's customary to send friends and relatives a pair of smoked Manx kippers, rather than the usual wish you were here postcards. And postcards, by the way, are still censored on the Isle of Man. Canes and Clucases, Kellys and Commodes, Quines and Quails abound here on the island, and they're as common as the Browns, Smiths and Jones are in England. This electric tram was built for the tourists in September 1893 between Douglas and Ramsey, and it's resisted all attempts to modernise it. There's even a branch line that goes to the top of Snave Fell, which is the highest mountain on the island, from the top of which you can see 5 kingdoms: England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Man. The Wakes Weeks of the Lancashire mill towns and the annual Glasgow Fair holiday saw mass migrations of thousands of working people to the island. Douglas grew from a somewhat squalid fishing village into a Victorian seaside resort stretching round a splendid bay. A network of public transport kept pace with these developments. Perhaps not as speedy as the TT motorbike, but infinitely safer, these horse-drawn trams are still the favourite with holidaymakers. Few countries make better use of their Scandinavian heritage than the Manx. Today's Vikings no longer bring fire, slaughter, rape and pillage to the island. Instead, they're part of the tourist scheme. Odin's Raven and ships like it brought the first great impact of overseas visitors to this island. The Vikings, whether welcome or not, they quickly made their mark. About 1,000 years later, the second great impact of visitors came from overseas, and they too have certainly made their mark, the tourists.
Well, I suppose really it owes its existence to Napoleon, because during the Napoleonic Wars, those genteel people who would travel the Grand Tour of Europe couldn't do so they did the Grand Tour of the British Isles. They go to the Highlands of Scotland. So included on the tour, they would come into Douglas, which in those days, of course, was considerably different from what you see behind me. 1830, I think, was the turning point for 2 reasons. First of all, it saw the establishment of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, which meant instead of sailing ships coming in, there was suddenly a steamship company who came in on a regular basis. And also, in that year, as you know, you had the Rainhill trials near Liverpool. And so, from that point on, the railway network spread across the north of England. And so suddenly people could get to Liverpool, and once they got to Liverpool, they had a regular service which brought them to the island. So from 1830, there was a general increase, but the biggest step was really in the 1870s. That's the Loch Promenade, named after Governor Loch, who was governor at the time. And the scheme was produced whereby they would create a promenade, which of course we just take for granted these days, but in those days it was somewhere to perambulate in the evening and be seen, I think, was the important bit. Whilst we look at it now as a crescent, as a continuous terrace, it's hard to imagine that the fact that plots were sold individually, the properties were erected individually, and so over a 10-year period you would sort of have one hotel, a gap, and then another couple, and then a gap. But the whole thing was to an overall design, although each house is different if you look closely, and hence we get this marvellous crescent. Well, from the Victorian period, this general growth of increase in boarding houses resulted in a large population increase during the summer months. So you saw places of entertainment growing up. There were theatres, music halls. Subsequently, of course, there were electric picture houses. In fact, Douglas, up to a few years ago, had 5 picture houses. Now it's down to 2. Entertainment, in fact, the principal place of entertainment, the Palace Lido, dates back from the 1890s. when you had the industrial north, it was nice for people to get away from it, from the smoke, and come to get the fresh air, to see the beauty, because of course when they arrived here, although they stayed in Douglas, they would go off on the steam train, the electric tram, they would go off in Landau or whatever, and get out into the country where they would explore the glens, many of which were developed during Victorian times. And really, people come today for exactly the same experience, to get away from the maddening crowd, to appreciate fresh air, and there's plenty of it, and also this natural beauty, because on an island so small, you go around the coast, you go from cliffs to sandy beaches, everything, you know, the whole of the British Isles is condensed into one small area. I would like to think of the island in some degree as timeless. When you get off the boat, you have stepped back, in fact, 100 years. When you walk onto that promenade, you get onto a horse tram going back to 1876, you get to the other end and go on an electric tram. Yes, you could virtually imagine yourself going well back in time. And then, of course, we have this marvellous theatre, the Gaiety Theatre, designed by Frank Matcham, and that opened in 1900, although the building, in fact, is 7 years older than that. I think what distinguishes it is the fact that nothing has changed. It is virtually the same as 1900. There have been one or two fire doors added of recent, but they've been added in such a position as not to interfere with the fibrous plasterwork or the general concept. And I think what is different about that, as far as Matcham is concerned, that unlike many of the thousands of theatres he worked on, this was a conversion of a music hall, a long barrel of a building, and in that he created a totally different atmosphere, virtually like a stage set itself. Yet he was working within very small confines and a very small budget.
Yet all was not sweetness and light. Twice this century, the Isle of Man's been turned into a vast internment camp for enemy aliens. In the First World War, the site now occupied by the island's experimental farm, Knockalo, near Peel, was converted into a vast, hutted encampment, housing many, many thousands of people. In the Second World War, towns such as Port Erin, Port St Mary, Peel, and parts of Ramsey and Douglas became home to thousands of men, women, and children of German and Italian extraction. For many, the island holds bitter memories of those dark years, but here in Hutchinson Square, once one of the largest of the internment camps in Douglas, art overcame adversity. Here, many eminent musicians, scientists, doctors, and writers were interned. Soon they began to produce a newspaper, discussion groups sprang up, lectures were given, and a sort of internment university was established, staffed by some of the ablest minds in Western Europe. And in houses round this square, there came together for the first time one of the most talented of all musical quartets, the Amadeus Quartet.
My first bit of defence of the realm was taking the Anthony's to the pictures on Thursday afternoon. And I hadn't been here, I don't think, much more than 48 hours when I began to realise that the internment camp, in my opinion, was pretty crazy. And the thing to do was observe the regulations you thought needed observing and ignore the rest.
What was crazy about it?
Well, it was desperately important, I understood from my sergeant. On this visit to the cinema, the single women sat to one side, and the married couples from the upper part of the internment camp sat on the other, and the locals sat at the back. And we would patrol in the middle to make sure there was no contact between them, you see. I mean, the war might have been lost after all. So I sat down and watched the picture and came home. I can't remember lying awake at night worrying about things that were happening here. I certainly didn't. We were supposed, of course, because of the rules and regulations, to see there was no fraternising. But that was absolute nonsense. I mean, we all knew perfectly well what went on. fire escape at the back of the Bellevue Hotel, and I had it confirmed after the war went on. I mean, there were 1 or 2 illegitimate babies born here, and we all knew perfectly well that the fathers were Manx. In the camp itself, it was depressing and cold, of course. There was hardships here. But, you know, the cold in these enormous hotel rooms with, you know, with perhaps a 2-bar electric fire to keep it warm and so on. Most of the internees spent their days in their bedroom, those who weren't actually working. But compared with what people were putting up with in London and so forth, this place was blissful. But on the other hand, one could see how hard internment was. The loss of one's liberty takes a lot of making up for. I think one would put up with bombs and food shortages and so forth to be able to come and go as one likes. The fact that one can't, the deprivation of liberty, is one of the most hard things you can do to people.
One of the undeniable charms of the island is its detachment from the present. Here there's still a feeling of the 40s and 50s. That's not to say that Douglas hasn't its share of discos, bingo halls, casinos and the like. It certainly has. But in other parts of the island, there's almost a time warp, a sense of nostalgic regression to a period when the pace of life was slower. Here are butchers' shops which still put sawdust on the floor, and garages still displaying pre-war signs, looking for all the world as if they were film sets for a series of television advertisements for Hovis bread. Here too is a profusion of wild flowers which seem to have largely gone from the hedgerows of much of the rest of Britain.
I think we're very lucky in that we came quite late to the world of technology, that the spraying didn't go on quite as early here or quite as widely. We've still got vast tracts of land in the island that aren't sprayed with chemicals. So I think probably that has helped enormously. There's only about 300 sheep like this in the Isle of Man, and there are some across as well. But basically, this is a sheep unique to the Isle of Man. Their wool is, of course, of interest because, as you can see, the colour is lovely. It's very soft wool, which can be spun either very finely or very coarsely. But of course, I hardly dare say it in front of him, the meat is very nice. It's very sweet meat, dark in texture, and cuts beautifully cold, and of course nowadays is much in demand because it's low fat. The archaeologists are interested as well because the bones that have been found at Peel are all so far of Lockton type. And in some of the graves in the archaeological sites, for instance one not very far from here at Derby, part of a Viking cloak was found and the wool was identical to Lockton, but of course the archaeologists won't go as far as saying this was Lockton wool.
And if Manx cats and Lockton sheep are 2 of the most popular subjects for postcards, then this is the 3rd. It's said to be the largest water wheel in the world, the Lady Isabella at Laxey on the east coast of the island.
Well, it was built to pump water out of the mines. In the period in the middle of the 1800s, the mines were getting quite deep. They already had a pumping system, but it wasn't able to cope at the greater depths. And so this mine, this wheel was built to try and take the mine much deeper. And in fact, it continued from then right through till the end of the life of the mine.
What was being mined here?
Well, initially it was purely lead with a very heavy silver content, and those were the 2 valuable products. But again, in the 1800s, zinc, which originally had been a waste product, began to take on a much greater economic value, and in the end that really overtook the value of lead that was coming out. And the 2 centres of mining on the island were producing something like half of the total mine products from the British Isles at that period. And of course their profits were very great. When the mines were building up, they came in mainly from Cornwall. Captain Rowe was of a Cornish family, and it's probable that he and others, the Bordens, who were managers at Foxdale, brought in people that they knew. And in fact, if you go round the village now, you can still see a lot of the Cornish names, the Grocers, Redpaths, Senegals, Partingtons. There's a whole range of the names there still in the village. They had what they called the sick club for the miners, where through contributions from the men and from other sources of money, there was a very early sort of, company health service. A doctor was available, there was sick pay, and there was pay for widows of anyone killed. And money from the wheel, right from the start, went into that mines club. And that was part and parcel of the income. People, I think, in the early stages were paying threepence a time to go up to the top. But of course, really, I suppose it took off as a tourist attraction when the electric railway was built, which was in the 1890s. Well, the exodus had started really long before the mines actually finally closed. And as that was happening, so it was that, of course, one of the reasons for the closure, the import of ore from abroad, mines abroad were opening up. And really, the Manx miners went wherever there were mines, and in particular, South Africa, Australia, and California.
As well as horse trams and electric railways, the island has another form of archaic transport, a genuine steam railway. Parts of the original network, such as the long-abandoned line from Foxdale to St John's, were built in the 1880s as mineral lines, but others, such as this surviving section from Douglas to Castletown, was designed at the outset as a passenger line. Despite vicissitudes and financial uncertainties, it continues to function, a 19th century anachronism, but one which has become part of the nostalgia boom and as such is likely to remain. Until the beginning of the century, rural life was punctuated on land by seed time and harvest, and at sea by the arrival of the silver harvest, the great shoals of herring and mackerel.
At its height, which was between about 1853 and 1883, there were around about 316 vessels of around about 50 to 55 feet long. They were called nickeys, and they had a large dipping lug sail. They developed from the contacts that the Manx fishermen had with the Cornishmen. Many of the Cornishmen had the name Nicholas, and that's reputed to be the way the name Nicky appeared. The Nickeys were very fast vessels. There's some amazing stories of their trips to the Shetland Islands, perhaps 600 miles away, where they were coming back at round about 10 knots, one vessel reaching the island in 57 hours. Another vessel from Peel, the Elvira, going to Bantry Bay in 26 hours. So they were extremely fast vessels. They were crewed by 7, usually the young lad, a cook, would be around about 11 or 12 on his early visits to sea, really. Around about 1500 plus that the smuggling took off. And it took off for the following reasons. First of all, and most important, the customs dues were very much less on the island than they were on the English mainland. Secondly, the Isle of Man lay central to England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales and provided a good redistribution centre. And I suppose the other factor is the one that is important in any case, and that is sheer money. And this was the great power behind it all. The lords' officers, members of the House of Keys, merchants, and a great multitude of people were initially sending some goods to friends and relatives on the mainland, and they no doubt had another circle of friends, so the whole thing mushroomed. And it got to such great proportions that the English government in the 1700s were losing between at least it's estimated, 300,000 and 500,000 pounds a year. For example, one of the vessels was reputed to be carrying 5,000 gallons of brandy from France, and this was brought back to the island. At the time, the customs due was 1 shilling a ton, which was around about 250 gallons, and they were obviously trying to avoid this as well. I think the fishermen now and in the past are pretty superstitious, and there are certain words and certain things that would upset the fishermen now and very much so in the past. For example, they wouldn't refer to a rabbit, they'd call the little furry fellow, or the pink-fleshed fish they would call a queer fellow, and the word would never be used. The same with vermin. The big mouse was called the longtail, and whistling at sea was also thought to be unlucky. To meet a red-haired woman on the quay was very bad luck and well worth going home if you'd done it. So I would say they were very, very superstitious, like most fisher folk.
Of course, herring fishing wasn't a whole-time occupation, since it lasted only between July and October. The rest of the year was spent on the land. In other words, the economy was based on crofting and fishing, a familiar enough pattern in all Celtic societies.
The men, certainly in the village here at Cregneash, were primarily crofting by a combination of small-scale farming and fishing. They mainly went to the Port St Mary fishing fleet, just over the hill and down the road here, which had about 120-odd boats in the fleet in the 1880s, so it was substantial. And there were 40-odd people, the census tell us, going from Cregneash to the fishing, as they say here in the Isle of Man, 10 of whom were skippers. So they were away really for most of the spring and summer parts of the year, fishing not only the Manx waters but up to Kinsale in Southern Ireland and then up to the Shetlands. So it really fell on the women to do the bulk of the heavy farm work, including the harvest, and the men perhaps were just back in time for ploughing and preparing the fields again for the next season. So coupled with that, of course, was the work in the sort of room we're in here, the taimur, or the kitchen of the traditional Manx cottage, where the cholloch, the open hearth, was very much the focal point, not only for heating, but of course for living round, for telling the stories round, and for cooking. And also, you'll notice in here that there's just half a roof coming across the room we're sitting in here. The half loft, or cock loft as it's called, probably being used for storage, or if there were kids, where the kids would sleep. And then just a little bedroom at the back. But it's amazing how big some of the families were that were living in these sort of houses and seemingly prospering very well. Well, there's the old saying, you never catch cold at sea, isn't there? And I suppose to some extent that meant a lot to the people in terms of the lifestyle they had. They were outdoors as long as they could be. Either the men were out fishing, the women were out in the fields, or perhaps sat indoors spinning, weaving, earning that extra bit of the living that goes with the small-scale farming. There were a number of people, and some who perhaps were doing the hardest work, going to the fishing for 20, 30 years at a time, who lived well into their 60s and 70s, which is perhaps slightly above average. So perhaps it's something that we should look to and learn from. Perhaps we have it too easy now.
What was the diet?
Well, oats were grown quite extensively, and oatcake, as in many regions of certainly the western part of Britain, constituted a great part of the diet. Potatoes and herring, of course, herring roasted in front of the fire were a staple, and fish generally, of course, was important. Everything homemade, home-cooked, home-baked. Really, I think, the sort of diet that doesn't cause the sort of problems that doctors are just recognizing about today's diet. I think money would have a very little part to play in an area like this in the Isle of Man. And it must be remembered, I think, that this is just one area that's been specifically chosen to show this. There were a number of areas like this throughout the Isle of Man. Indeed, there's a story about one man that used to whatever money he had, he buried in an old cow horn out the back of the building. It shows you, I think, how often he needed access to it. They used to gather in people's cottages on a rota basis for a weeknight service. They'd gather in people's cottages anyway, and certain cottages were known particularly to be places of gathering. There's a little ruined cottage just across the way from here at the Carron farmstead, where a lady called Margaret Brydeson lived, and she was, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, a great attraction for both the men and the other girls in the village.
You can't tear up an Isle of Man pound note. It's plastic. That's just a small indication of the importance of cash in the economy of this island. Income tax stands at 20p in the pound. There's no capital gains tax, no surtax, no death duties. It has consequently become something of a tax haven. And there's a growing banking business. We're at the centre of a cluster of banks in Douglas. We're in Athol Street, named after the Duke of Athol, who put a cash transaction at the centre of the Isle of Man's history when he sold this island to the British government in 1765 for £70,000. And if that seems a rather suspicious amount of money, then we're in a rather suspicious street, because the saying is in Douglas that Athol Street is the only street which is shady on both sides. But henceforth, after that sale, the sovereign of Great Britain would also be the Lord of Man. In addition, English customs officers now had the right to come into Manx ports and search suspected ships. To some extent, the island lost a degree of autonomy. However, because the island has its own laws and its own parliament, it controls its own budget. And this means that, like the Channel Islands, it can and does determine its own taxes.
I think the principal benefit is that the island has control of its own money. It raises its taxes. Admittedly, indirect taxes have to be the same as in England because of the United Kingdom, because of the Customs and Excise Agreement. But it raises its own money and it spends its own money. It doesn't have to seek approval from London as to whether the money is spent on a new school or on extra benefits for the old people or benefits to local industries or whatever. That, I think, is the principal advantage. The island is totally autonomous in terms of how it spends its money. In 1980, the island did set up its own separate customs and excise service, so we now have a separate administration, but working under laws which are kept in parallel with those of the United Kingdom. A lot of thought has been given to the possibility of ending that agreement, but there are difficulties, and one of the principal difficulties is that it would create a barrier between the island and the United Kingdom, which certainly those in some businesses would feel would be harmful to them.
This unprepossessing terraced mound at St. John's could well be regarded as the most potent symbol of the Kingdom of Man. Here on Old Midsummer's Day, July the 5th each year, the Manx Parliament meets in the open air, following a tradition which goes back to the Vikings. Here in the Isle of Man, the tradition is still respected. The Lord of Man, or her representative, in this case Prince Edward, processes from the chapel of St. John along a ceremonial routeway strewn with rushes, an offering to the sea god Manannan. petitions can be presented to the court and the laws are read in Manx and in English.
Income Tax, etc. Amendment Act, which amends the law relating to income tax and abolishes land speculation tax.
Slatas kish tjetstiach as eilied leathaker. Ta leathaker in lai ta bentenrish a kish a tjetstiach as mucher and kish delel temach ons talu.
Number 15, Road Traffic Act, which amends the law relating to road traffic.
Slatas Trollty and a region. Ta leathaker in lai ta bentenrish Trollty and a region.
Number 16, Local Government Act, which amends local government law.
Slatas
I think probably there are disadvantages. Some people would see that the island, the independence of the island means that there's perhaps a delayed implementation of certain social reforms and legislation which the United Kingdom introduces. Now that again, of course, is controversial because some people would say that that's a good thing, but certainly others would see perhaps the introduction of redundancy payments, for example, as having been too long delayed in the island, which would not have occurred if the island had been part of the United Kingdom. In essence, it means, of course, that these decisions have to be taken locally. And if one is in favour of some of the changes in the United Kingdom, one perhaps might resent the delay in their implementation here. On the other hand, if one thinks that some of these changes should not have taken place in the United Kingdom, then the fact that the island does not have to follow suit and sometimes doesn't may be seen as an advantage. It's a historical fact that the corporal punishment was abolished in England on the statute book in 1948. Generally speaking, changes of that sort are followed in Manx legislation, but generally after a period of years. In this particular case, that was not done, and it remains on the statute book. It's a matter of great controversy whether that's right or wrong, but the fact is that in the 1970s, the issue was taken to the European Court of Human Rights. And that court held that the exercise of that punishment was contrary to the Convention on Human Rights. Now, from that point on, it really became impractical, in legal terms, for the courts to use it here. So it hasn't been exercised for 10 years, and I think the subject is really now passing into history.
The island has always been noted for holidays, but recently numbers have started to decline. Whether it's the cheap package tours to Spain or the threat of pollution from Sellafield only 35 miles away to the east, the Manx government has its own views.
I think if you lived here over a period of years, you would find that there's been a growing anxiety on the part of the Manx people in respect of the Sellafield operation. And that anxiety perhaps started when we learnt that the Irish Sea had been used as an experimental area by Her Majesty's government for the deliberate ascertainment, if you like, of what patterns of pollution would do to a marine environment. Now, no notice of that particular development was given to this government, who have a very keen interest in the Irish Sea environmental pattern. And from there on, of course, there have been the all too frequent accidents at Sellafield.
Well, of course, we're only 35 miles from Sellafield. Fortunately, as you can feel, the prevailing wind goes from the island towards Sellafield, so that most of the effluent that is airborne is blown away from the island. The discharge into the sea, again, are swept northwards by the sea currents towards Scotland rather than directly towards the island. Now, that's not to say there isn't a large concentration of radioactive material in the North Sea, as well as in the Irish Sea, because it's been swept around the entire coast, and it's all derived from Sellafield. Now, the danger of this is that it may get into the organisms, particularly those that we eat. And it's certainly true that the sea between here and Sellafield is probably the most intensively fished area around the British coast. Having said that, the concentrations are really very low. And even if you were a fishaholic and had fish every day, you've got about 500 times more chance of being killed by flu than by anything that might derive from Sellafield at the present levels of concentration.
Like all foreign countries, this one has its own language, Manx.
There are 6 Celtic languages, Scottish, Irish and Manx Gaelic. And then the other cousins are Welsh, Breton and Cornish, yeah. It's the same as Scottish Gaelic virtually. It's mutually intelligible with Scottish Gaelic, yeah. I started to learn it actually when I was a young man, about 22, when I'd just come out of the army, because it was never taught in school, you see. And at that time there were about 13 native speakers still alive. And there was my generation, there were quite a crowd of us, used to spend a lot of time with them. So we learned it from the native speakers and also from the grammar books and the Manx Bible and prayer book and things like that. And we became quite proficient, so quite a few of us are actually virtually bilingual. At least we think we are until we try and translate the television news verbatim, you know, which is quite difficult. I could say the Lord's Prayer for you. It's Ein ton sneeuw, Kajarik de rau de enem, de jig de riach, de agne de rau jint de het halu mate on sneeuw, Kodun en aran Jew as kachlei, as leidon en lochten met de shingen leidausen te jinu lochten en oi, as na liedjen on smiolach ach seertjen vai olk, son liatser riach as a fuer gloa, son de brech as de brech. That's what the language actually sounds like. And then even the Norsemen who came here and colonized the island eventually Gaelicized their names. So you get names like Corkel, which was Mac Thor Kettle, which means the son of Thor's cauldron. And eventually they Gaelicized all the Norse names as well, you see. And then when English started to become more powerful in the island, the Mac disappeared. And they all started to spell their names with C, Q, and K. And that's still the case today. You'll find most Manx, genuine Manx names are C, Q, and K.
So who are we talking about? Can you give us some instances of those names?
Yes, Corkel, Kinraid, Quilliam, Carouche, Kelly, Kenyak. They all start with a K sound, you see, and it's the final C in Mac. That's where they all came from.
Do you think the interest that you and your generation have in this language and in reviving it, do you think that is going to outlast your generation or not?
It'll outlast my generation, but how long it'll last, I don't know. Because all minority languages are on the road to extinction anyway. Eventually, what is the world going to speak? A mixture of Chinese, Russian, English, languages like Welsh, Breton, Manx, Irish, they're bound to disappear eventually. It's very sad, really, because it's like losing a species, you know, an endangered species, really. Once it's gone forever, unless it's kept on film or on tape or something like that. But even then, the reality of it has disappeared.
Although the language has started to disappear, some of the signs of early settlement remain. Christianity first came to the island in the 5th century and found it settled by the Vikings before them.
Just as St. Patrick himself took Christianity from Britain across the Irish Sea westwards to Ireland, so it was this westward movement of Celtic peoples that brought Christianity to the Isle of Man, probably in the 5th century. And the forms of early Christianity here seem to be very similar to those in Ireland and the other parts of the Celtic west of Britain, represented really by little keels, little Celtic chapels, and also by carved stone cross slabs on the graves of the dead, which is a very characteristic feature. And the Isle of Man is very rich in these. The crosses went on in the island probably from perhaps 5th, 6th century through to the 11th century in Celtic and then later in Norse times. And there are 188 cross slabs, I think, from the Isle of Man. It's a very large and important corpus of evidence for early Christianity. A stone with a runic inscription was found right up at the top of the far valley, the Cornet Valley. And the runic inscription actually reads, Christ, Malachi, Patrick, Adamnan. Of all the sheep in Cornedal, Ewan the priest is the shepherd. Cornedal is the name of the valley. And what the inscription really means, I think, is that the priest here at the newly established parish church at Mackhold was telling the people up in the far valley, now I'm your priest. You must stop going to the Keel, you must come down to the parish church. And this was happening, I'm sure, all over the Isle of Man. The Keels were being closed down and the parish churches, all of them, I think, established on sites of Keels, were becoming preeminent. I think we must recognize that the social mix between the Norse and the Celts was really quite complex. We mustn't think of the sort of Norman Saxon kind of situation where the Norsemen came in as the ruling class and the Celts were all serfs underneath, because one of the finest of the crosses in the Isle of Man, signed actually by the Norse sculptor Gaut, is erected by a man with a Celtic name whose father had a Celtic name. So clearly there were Celts up there in the upper echelons of Manx society in the 10th century.
Beneath many of the Christian sites lie the remains of a previous settler, the Vikings. They left behind some beautiful artifacts like this lady's necklace and built many settlements, remains of which are still evident today.
The site we're on at the moment, which is called Chapel Hill Balladule, is one of the first evidences we've got of a Viking settlement in the Isle of Man. We're sitting actually on the edge of a grave of a ship burial of a Viking warrior who must have died somewhere about 850, 875, something like that. He was buried in a boat about 11 meters long, and with him was a shield and horse trappings and various other items of that sort of nature. And he represents the first incoming people in the island. And throughout the island, particularly in the north of the island, you have large numbers of crosses, stone crosses carved with Scandinavian motifs. It's one of the richest group of Scandinavian crosses in the West, really. We have also on these crosses runic inscriptions which show the mixture of population. For instance, on one cross it says that a Viking married a Celtic woman, and so you have that mixture of the two populations. This wasn't a place where everybody came in and raped and pillaged and burnt and did everything else that the Vikings are traditionally meant to do. It seems as though the settlement was reasonably peaceful and that the people settled down to farm these islands. The crosses are really the only main things that we have got, although we have got a few settlement sites. There is one major farm, which again is a continuity site, a continuity from the Celtic peoples beforehand, at the Braid, up in the hills. Beautiful site with a round house in one part of the site and then two long houses, one of which has got bowed sides to it, of a type which we know from Scandinavia and from various parts of England. That is one of the very few places where you can actually see the remains of Scandinavian houses at this particular period. We have enormous numbers of names of places which are Scandinavian here. Dalby, Colby, places like that are the type of place name with a by suffix. The ending is by, which means farm. and those occur all over the island. The name of the highest mountain on the island, well, it's just a mountain, it's about 8 feet over 2,000 feet, which is meant to make it a mountain. It's called Snæ Fell, the Snow Mountain.
There's a saying that if you stand on one of the peaks on the west side of the Lake District and look out at the Isle of Man, and if you can see it, that means that it's going to rain. If you can't see it, that means it's already raining. This fairly representative example of a Cumbrian joke indicates a larger truth about the Isle of Man, that it has winked its way in and out of the British consciousness for over 1,000 years, now forcing itself on us, now forgotten sometimes for centuries. Because the most remarkable thing about the Isle of Man is that it's maintained its own self-enclosed independence. Like everybody else outside the privileged southeast of England, everybody else in the British Isles, it's trying to manoeuvre its way into the 21st century. But the Isle of Man has one advantage over the rest of us, perhaps to be found in its motto, Quocunque iaceris stabit, whichever way you throw me, I will stand. And the Isle of Man, we must remember, has 3 legs to stand on.